When she slapped me across the face, I felt something inside me shatter in a way I never thought possible. It was mid-afternoon when it happened, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, warm and golden, brushing across the chipped edges of my old oak table. The smell of the jasmine tea I'd just poured still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of rain from the garden outside. I had been arranging some papers, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the creeping unease I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And then she was there, standing in front of me, eyes flashing with an anger I didn't understand. "Give me the house keys," she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut glass. I remember the sting of her palm across my cheek, the sharpness of it, not just physically, but the betrayal that accompanied it. My heart pounded, not just from the slap, but from the realization that this wasn't just anger. This was intention. And it was directed at me, my home, my family, my life as I had known it. Before that day, my life had been ordinary in the most comforting ways. My mornings began with the aroma of tea and toast, my husband's quiet humming in the background as he read the newspaper. My son would rush past with a laugh, the sound of his shoes echoing against the tiled floor, while I would shake my head, smiling, pretending not to enjoy the chaos. The garden thrived under my careful attention, roses and marigolds thriving along the fence. Even my daughter-in-law, when she first joined our family, had brought a certain lightness into our home. I remember those early days with her vividly. She was polite, eager to learn our routines, quick with a joke or a gentle compliment. I had even thought, perhaps foolishly, that she and I might become close, more than just in-laws, maybe friends. She had a smile that could soften my sharpest edges, a laugh that blended into our own in the living room like it belonged there. That illusion, however, was fragile. The first hints that something was amiss were subtle. A curt tone in her voice when she spoke to me about the simplest things, like whether the kitchen was cleaned or if I had touched her things. A glance, sharp and calculating, when my son mentioned a plan or decision that she clearly wanted to influence. I told myself I was imagining things. Perhaps she was stressed. Perhaps marriage brought out tension I couldn't yet see. But deep down, an unease had begun to nest in my chest, one that refused to be shaken off by ordinary conversations or reassuring smiles. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, the kind where sunlight feels gentle enough to mask shadows, that her true colors emerged. She demanded the keys. And when I hesitated, questioning what she meant, her hand rose, not in a warning, but in an execution of her intent. The slap resonated through me, echoing louder than any argument could. My mind raced. Why now? Why the keys? What had I missed in the months of polite smiles and silent calculations? My son, oblivious in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, didn't notice the storm unfolding behind him. And there I was, rooted to the spot, feeling my authority, my sense of safety, my home itself being challenged by the woman I had tried to welcome into my family. I could feel tears threatening to fall, not just from the sting, but from the betrayal itself, the raw, piercing realization that the woman I had welcomed into my home might never have respected it, or me. And yet, even in that moment, part of me wanted to understand, to reason, to find some fragment of the woman I thought I knew. But the question hung in the air, could trust ever be restored after such an act? Would you like me to continue the next part? In the days before that moment, life had been deceptively ordinary, wrapped in the comforting rhythms of routine. I would wake before dawn, the house quiet except for the soft breathing of my husband, and brew a pot of tea. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the faint aroma of cardamom, a scent that always seemed to promise clarity, even when life was anything but clear. Breakfast was always a quiet affair, the ticking of the old wall clock keeping time with the scraping of spoons against porcelain. My son had always been a source of gentle chaos. He had a laugh that could fill a room and a stubborn streak that sometimes made me despair. And then there was her, my daughter-in-law. On most mornings, she moved about the house with a purposeful grace, tidying up, checking that the fridge was stocked, asking my husband if he needed anything. She smiled often, but lately, I noticed that her smiles had taken on a different quality, a sharpness, a precision that seemed almost rehearsed. I told myself I was overthinking. Mothers always worry, especially about daughters-in-law. We see shadows where there are none, imagine slights that don't exist. And yet, something about the way she lingered in the kitchen doorway, glancing at me while speaking to my son, left a small, gnawing pit in my stomach. It was the little things that began to add up. A missing grocery receipt that she claimed she had taken, even though I had set it on the counter myself. The subtle rearrangement of furniture that made the living room feel less like a shared home and more like a showroom she was controlling. And then, there were the phone calls, private, hurried conversations whispered in corners, her eyes flicking to me, challenging me to notice but never letting me understand. I tried to ignore it. I repeated to myself that families are complicated, that sometimes people act out in ways we don't understand. I told my husband, casually, she's just stressed from work, and he nodded absently, eyes glued to his newspaper. My son, ever oblivious, never seemed to notice anything beyond his own plans and priorities. And so I carried on, tending to my garden, brewing tea, speaking gently to my husband about the day, keeping the house running like clockwork while a subtle storm brewed under the surface. Then came the evening when the first clue really shook me. She had come to me, ostensibly to ask about a family gathering we were planning. But her tone was clipped, almost confrontational. She leaned against the doorway, eyes sharp, and said, "You know, I think it's time you give me more responsibility here. You can't keep controlling everything." Her words, ordinary on the surface, carried an undertone I couldn't ignore, a quiet assertion of power, a challenge to the life I had built. I remember standing there, tea in hand, the steam warming my fingers, and feeling a tremor of unease. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, trying to mask the anxiety threading through me. She smiled then, not warmly, but in a way that made my stomach knot. "You'll see," she said, turning on her heel and leaving the room with that carefully measured grace, like a storm that had yet to arrive but was already shaking the trees outside. After she left, the house felt smaller, somehow. The ticking clock suddenly loud, the smell of the tea cloying, the shadows stretching in corners I had always taken for granted. It was in that moment I realized that this wasn't about stress, or misunderstandings, or ordinary family tension. There was intent behind her actions, a quiet, deliberate force that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant hum of the city outside, thinking about how subtly trust could erode. How easily a home, built on years of love and routine, could feel alien in a single evening. I didn't yet know the full extent of what she was planning, but a sense of inevitability settled over me, heavy and unyielding. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. I poured tea, watched the steam curl upward, and greeted my son with a smile that felt fragile, like it might shatter with the slightest touch. But the tension in the house was palpable, a quiet undercurrent that made the walls seem narrower, the air heavier. I could sense her presence before I saw her, her shoes clicking against the floor, the faint scent of her perfume drifting in from the hallway, sharp and deliberate. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. My favorite mug, the one I kept in the top cabinet, was missing. A pile of letters I had stacked neatly on the counter had been rifled through. And then there were the questions, innocent at first, about bills, schedules, and who held which keys, but each question carried an edge, as if she were testing boundaries I had never imagined would be tested. One afternoon, I noticed her lingering outside my bedroom door. She had a strange, calculating look in her eyes, tilting her head as she asked, "Do you really need all the space? Maybe some rooms could be reorganized." Her words were soft, but the intent behind them was sharp, invasive. I smiled politely, my heart thumping against my ribs. "Of course, dear," I replied, though inside I was recoiling. There was something cold in that smile of hers, a precision that suggested she was already imagining a world where I was less in control, less at the center of my own home. It wasn't just the house that felt different. My son, who had always been my anchor, seemed distracted, caught in the middle of her subtle maneuvers. He didn't notice the way she would interrupt our conversations, insert herself between us during discussions about finances or family plans. I could see the tension in his eyes, but he always brushed it off, laughing awkwardly or changing the subject. I began to pay closer attention. I would find small discrepancies in bills and bank statements, unexplained charges that had her signature on approvals I hadn't given. Her questions about my routines started to feel like surveillance rather than curiosity. She learned which mornings I tended the garden, which afternoons I did the laundry, and subtly began inserting herself into those moments, rearranging things, leaving notes, sometimes moving objects from one room to another. It was meticulous, deliberate, and unnerving. One evening, I confronted her gently, trying to gauge her intent without creating immediate conflict. I noticed the bank statement was different, I said, showing her the page. Did you make these changes? She looked at me, tilting her head, lips pursed in what I initially thought was hesitation, but soon realized was confidence, a calculated calm. Oh, I thought I was helping, she said, her tone light but firm. It's just easier if I manage some things. Her eyes were sharp, unblinking. I felt the first real flicker of fear that she wasn't simply overstepping, but taking control with a purpose. After that, every corner of the house felt scrutinized. Every drawer, every lock, every object seemed like a potential battlefield. I started locking certain cabinets, leaving some keys in my pocket instead of the usual spot on the hook, watching her reaction when she asked for them. Her patience, I noticed, was growing thin, her temper simmering under polite smiles. There was a storm coming, and I could see it forming in her eyes every time our gazes met. The first clue had escalated into undeniable suspicion. The home I had built with love, patience, and decades of care now felt precarious, like walking on a glass bridge with someone shaking the supports beneath me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just about organization or control, it was something far more personal, far more dangerous. Something that would demand a confrontation I wasn't ready for, but couldn't avoid. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the betrayal fully revealed itself. The house smelled of fresh bread baking in the oven, a scent I usually found comforting, but that day it only underscored the shock that was about to unfold. I was in the living room, straightening cushions and tidying up, when I noticed the front door slightly ajar. My heart sank immediately. Our doors were always locked when someone wasn't entering or leaving. I stepped closer, calling out softly, "Is someone there?" Silence answered me. My instincts flared, and I moved cautiously toward the door, my hand brushing against the polished wood of the table for balance. And then I saw her, my daughter-in-law, standing in the hallway, keys in her hand, a defiant glint in her eyes. "I need the keys," she said again, her voice steady, no longer asking but demanding. "Now." I froze. The stack of papers I'd been sorting slipped from my hands, scattering across the floor. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer was not about convenience or errands. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a flash of anger, pure, deliberate. "You've had your time running things. It's mine now," she said, almost coldly, and I realized this wasn't about control, it was about possession. My house. My life. My family. I remember the slap vividly. It was swift, shocking, and filled with all the aggression she had been suppressing behind polite smiles. Pain radiated across my cheek, but the real sting came from the realization that she didn't fear me, didn't respect me, and had no intention of honoring the life we had shared under this roof. My voice trembled, though I tried to remain calm. "This isn't your place to demand anything. This house, it belongs to our family." Her laughter was quiet, sharp, and mocking. "Our family? You mean you and him? I've been part of this family for years. But now, it's my turn to make decisions." I wanted to shout, to cry, to do something, but the room felt suspended, the air heavy and suffocating. My son, oblivious as ever, was in his study, headphones on, lost in his own world. My husband was at the grocery store. I was alone with her fury, and the clarity hit me like a blow. She had been planning this for months. Every small manipulation, every subtle intrusion, every polite smile hiding irritation, it all pointed to this moment. I asked myself over and over how I could have been so blind. I replayed every interaction, every glance that felt off, every moment of unease that I had brushed aside. And now, faced with the cold, unrelenting truth, I felt a mix of disbelief, heartbreak, and a slow, simmering rage. She moved closer, holding the keys like a trophy. "You're going to give them to me," she said, her voice low but firm. I could see the moral line she had crossed, the one between ambition and cruelty, and it sent a chill through me. I stepped back, heart pounding, but something inside me refused to yield. "I won't," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You can't just take what doesn't belong to you. This isn't about power, it's about respect. And you've lost that." Her expression flickered, was it surprise, irritation, or fear, but she recovered quickly, her composure returning. "Then we'll see," she said, and for the first time, I realized that this confrontation was just the beginning. That day, the house, once a sanctuary, became a battlefield. I had seen her intentions, clear and unmasked, and I knew that the coming days would force me to act, not out of anger, but out of necessity. She wasn't simply challenging me, she was challenging the very foundation of our family. And I knew that if I didn't respond wisely, I would lose more than just keys. After that day, I realized that caution had to replace shock. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a chessboard, and every step had to be calculated. I couldn't let anger dictate my actions, not if I wanted to protect my family, my son, and the life I had built. So, I began observing her more carefully, noting patterns, timing, and moods, trying to predict her next move. I started with small, subtle measures. Locks were changed quietly, duplicate keys removed, important documents secured in a safe I had kept for emergencies. I documented every interaction, texts, emails, conversations, more for my own clarity than for anyone else. I wanted to understand her, to see the person behind the polite smiles that had concealed so much ambition and malice. The next confrontation was inevitable. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen again, the same defiant look in her eyes, but this time I was ready. She demanded to know where the spare keys were, her voice low but sharp, a mixture of entitlement and irritation. I didn't answer immediately. I stood my ground, letting the silence stretch long enough for her impatience to show. Finally, I spoke. "I'm not giving them to you," I said, calm but firm. "This isn't just about keys. It's about trust, respect, and boundaries. You've shown none of these, and I won't reward disrespect with access to my home." Her reaction was swift, almost theatrical. She stepped closer, voice rising. "You can't control me forever. This house, this family, it's mine too, whether you like it or not." I held her gaze, noticing the tremor in her voice that betrayed the composure she tried to project. "I'm not trying to control you," I said, my tone gentle, almost pleading. "I'm protecting myself and the people I care about. You've pushed every boundary, and it's time you understand the consequences of your actions." That moment marked a shift. She realized that I was not weak, not pliable, not someone to be intimidated. I could see it in her eyes, the first flicker of doubt, a hesitation in her carefully constructed bravado. It was subtle, but enough for me to recognize that the tide was turning. Over the next days, I took more measured actions. I contacted my son, carefully explaining the inconsistencies I had noticed, not in accusations, but in observations. I wanted him to understand without feeling manipulated or caught in the middle. Slowly, he began to see what had been unfolding before his eyes, the tiny seeds of deceit she had planted that had grown into something dangerous. I also involved a neutral third party, a family counselor, someone who could mediate without taking sides. I hoped that the presence of an objective voice would prevent escalation and provide clarity. I knew that confrontation alone wasn't enough, strategy, patience, and evidence were necessary. Each day, I maintained a calm exterior, even as my mind raced with planning and anticipation. I moved quietly, watching for patterns, documenting everything. I knew the public confrontation would come eventually, the point where her behavior could no longer be ignored or denied. And I wanted to ensure that when it did, it would be undeniable, clear, and just. The act of reclaiming control wasn't about revenge, it was about self-preservation, about teaching her and my family that respect and integrity were not optional. Every small decision I made, every calculated pause, was a step toward exposing the truth without stooping to cruelty. And slowly, I began to feel a sense of empowerment. Not the kind born of anger or retaliation, but the quiet, resolute strength of someone who refuses to be bullied in their own home. I was ready for the next stage, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden, when the consequences of her actions would unfold naturally. The moment of truth came sooner than I expected. It was during a small family gathering we had organized, something ordinary, a Sunday lunch with just close relatives, but carefully orchestrated on my part so that the dynamics would reveal themselves. The table was set with familiar dishes, the aroma of freshly baked bread mingling with the scent of roasted chicken and herbs from the garden. It all looked ordinary, but beneath the surface, the stage was ready. I watched her closely as she arrived, the confident smile plastered on her face, her steps measured. She tried to assert her usual control, guiding conversations, subtly criticizing the placement of cutlery, the arrangement of the tablecloth. But I remained calm, observing, noting, gently steering interactions without revealing my plan. It wasn't long before her impatience showed. She reached for a stack of envelopes on the sideboard, bills and statements I had intentionally left out, and attempted to sort them, muttering about efficiency. I intervened quietly, placing a hand over hers. "Perhaps we should wait until everyone is seated," I said softly, masking the tension in my voice. Her eyes flashed at me, a silent challenge, but I held my ground. The turning point came when I asked my cousin, who had always been a meticulous observer, to help me with a casual demonstration of household management, who holds which responsibilities, who manages the keys, and so forth. I framed it as a light, informal exercise, but it was anything but. As we went through the motions, my cousin subtly highlighted discrepancies that had been accumulating, payments made without authorization, changes in arrangements, and decisions that should have required family consensus. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She tried to laugh it off, brushing it aside with a sarcastic comment, but the cracks in her composure were visible. The polite facade she had maintained for months crumbled under the weight of the evidence, the quiet observation, and the gentle confrontation. Other relatives began to notice, asking questions, expressing confusion over the inconsistencies. I could feel the tension ripple through the room. My son, finally connecting the dots, exchanged a glance with me that spoke volumes, shock, disbelief, and a dawning understanding of what had been happening right under his nose. My daughter-in-law's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The moral and social consequences of her actions had begun to unfold in real time. She tried to salvage the situation with excuses and justifications, but they sounded hollow, even to her. The weight of the truth pressed down. Family members shared subtle observations, times she had overstepped, actions that had seemed innocuous but now formed a clear pattern. Her credibility, built over months of manipulation and polite smiles, unraveled thread by thread. By the end of the gathering, the atmosphere had shifted completely. She was no longer the confident orchestrator she had imagined herself to be, but a figure of unease, confronted not with anger but with reason, evidence, and the quiet authority of someone wronged but not vengeful. The balance of power had shifted. I could feel the relief in the room, subtle but tangible, as if the house itself exhaled after months of silent tension. What struck me most wasn't the exposure of her actions, but the way the family responded. There was no shouting, no humiliation. Instead, there was recognition of the boundaries she had crossed and the understanding that respect and honesty were the pillars of our home. I had ensured that justice was served, not through cruelty, but through clarity, dignity, and patience. That day, I realized something profound: confrontation, when guided by patience and truth, carries far more weight than anger or revenge. And in exposing her behavior publicly, but with integrity, I had not only protected my home and my family, but had taught a lesson that would linger far longer than any argument or slap could have inflicted. In the days following that gathering, a quiet settled over the house, one that felt like relief after a storm. The tension that had haunted every hallway, every corner, was gone, replaced by something softer, measured, cautious, but ultimately calm. My daughter-in-law's behavior changed dramatically. The defiance and bravado were replaced with careful, almost reluctant politeness, and though she tried to maintain appearances, I could sense the internal reckoning she was undergoing. I began to rebuild my routines with the same deliberate care I had used to protect them. Tea in the morning, the garden tended, the familiar sounds of laughter from my son and his friends filling the rooms once again. I made an effort to include my daughter-in-law in small, controlled ways, allowing her space but under the gentle boundaries I had established. The goal was not punishment, but understanding, teaching her that trust and respect could not be forced, only earned. My son, who had initially struggled to recognize the reality of the situation, now approached me with a new understanding. We talked more openly than we ever had before, not about blame, but about lessons learned. I explained how subtle actions, repeated over time, could erode trust, and how courage and patience were sometimes more powerful than confrontation. He listened carefully, absorbing not just the story, but the underlying wisdom that had guided my actions. Slowly, the home regained its warmth. The garden bloomed again, the scent of tea in the morning became comforting once more, and the small noises of daily life, the scraping of chairs, the hum of conversation, the ticking of the clock, felt like music instead of background tension. I allowed myself to feel peace again, knowing that I had defended not only the physical space of my home but the moral space of my family. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, looking out over the garden, reflecting on the lessons the past weeks had imparted. I realized that betrayal often comes quietly, wrapped in smiles and polite words, and that the true test of character is not in the immediate confrontation, but in the calm, thoughtful response. Strength is not always loud, sometimes it is quiet, steady, and unwavering. I also learned the importance of observation, of noticing the small things before they become large problems. The missing receipts, the subtle manipulations, the changes in tone and expression, all of it had been warning signs, and I had learned to trust my instincts while keeping my patience intact. Forgiveness, too, played a role. I did not excuse her actions, nor did I pretend they had no impact. But I recognized that holding on to bitterness would not restore peace, only prolong suffering. By establishing boundaries and insisting on accountability, I allowed space for growth, both for her and for myself. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still, I found gratitude. For my husband's steady presence, for my son's eventual understanding, for the strength that had revealed itself in me when I needed it most. I realized that the storm had been a harsh teacher, but its lessons were invaluable. Respect must be maintained, trust cannot be assumed, and strength is measured not in retaliation, but in resolve. Our family, bruised but intact, had learned to navigate the delicate balance of love and boundaries. And I had learned, perhaps most importantly, that the dignity with which we face betrayal defines not just the outcome, but the legacy we leave behind.